right now, actually. Yeah. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of Finance and Corporate Services Committee, where we will be dealing with items with respect to the capital budget. I would ask if there are any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is kind of strange because this is not necessarily any longer the council's budget, it's more so the mayor's budget. But there are items included in the capital expenditures which are close proximity to properties that either I or my family owns. So this includes on C11, on Mill and Court, I think it's, yeah, anyways, Mill Community Center. And then additionally, the Rockway Center redevelopment, potentially they're kind of farther down, but I'll just recuse myself anyways. C39 on Franklin Street, King and Wilson.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Not seeing any others. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Lautenbach.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chair Davey, members of the committee. Today we'll be continuing discussions related to the draft 2024 budget, with the focus being on the capital budget. And we also have public input night scheduled for tonight as well. That will provide an opportunity for those that wish to come and speak to the budget in person, an opportunity to do so. And so this day really does represent for that last day of feedback ahead of then the formal budget being proposed on December 4th, and then obviously the legislated timeline that goes along with changes that have taken place this year related to our budget process. So today we're going to talk about the capital budget. We'll also touch on reserve and reserve funds, so that is something that we typically do cover when we talk about capital, as well as items such as debt. And as a reminder, this year's budget really has those three themes that it's focused on in terms of supporting city services, and we talked about that at the last meeting, really the operating budget and the day-to-day services that we provide each day to the community. This discussion today will obviously be in that middle category, focus on infrastructure, both in terms of the capital infrastructure that we're responsible for as a municipality. Also talk a little bit about new infrastructure that's needed to support a growing community. And then we also had discussions last meeting about advancing strategic priorities and priorities that are built into the budget to help advance our 2023 to 2026 strategic plan. When we think about the capital budget, there's a number of ways that priorities get identified and incorporated, both in terms of what we're planning to do in 2024, but also within the 10-year capital forecast. Predominantly, a large portion of the capital budget is focused on asset rehabilitation and replacement. And as a municipality, we're required to have asset management plans under OREG 58817 that identifies how we are planning to keep our assets in a state of good repair. Those plans, based on condition assessment data inspections, help inform priorities that you see in terms of timing within the capital forecast. And then funding mechanisms such as our water infrastructure program is an example of how we try to fund those elements within the budget. The budget also includes inputs in terms of a development charge study that's completed every 5 years, which identifies the new growth-related items that we're moving forward within the 10-year kind of window. That informs then what you see in the forecast as well. And certainly we've talked a little bit about some changes related to that framework. And then we also have strategic items that are also reflected within the capital budget, both operating and capital, as well as other plans that help inform what you see in the capital forecast, such as master plans, specific issues. All those things helped, and planning exercises that come before the budget help refine and determine what you see as priorities. In terms of the capital budget itself, as I mentioned, a lot of it is focused on that infrastructure renewal. We have $1.8 billion in planned spending over the next 10 years, and that obviously seems like a significant amount. And as I mentioned before, though, it's still not completely enough to address what our infrastructure needs are. but you do see sort of the breakdown in terms of what those major asset categories are. In terms of critical infrastructure, full road reconstructions making up a large portion of the capital budget, and that includes the underground, sandy the water and stormwater that goes along with that as well. Roads, bridges, and sidewalks. You have arenas, indoor rec, and also other city facilities, which is also another significant asset category. And then other things that are important as well, outdoor infrastructure such as parks, trails, and forestry. And so it's all about balancing those priorities within the capital forecast, but making sure that we're taking care of that critical infrastructure and doing our part in order to do that. Certainly as funding becomes more challenging, we are looking at continue that conversation, wanting both the provincial and federal government to provide more funding to address municipal infrastructure needs, because this is something that's not only facing Kitchener, but also municipalities across Ontario and Canada as well. And then when we think about growth-related infrastructure, recent changes to the Development Charges Act under Bill 23 and Bill 109 have presented some challenges in terms of how we look at how we're going to fund new infrastructure going forward. Based on our initial assessment this year, we have a shortfall of about $5.5 million, and that's just year-to-date in 2023, in terms of lost revenue associated with those changes. And so, if you think about that over a 10-year time frame, that's $55 million. Likely that number is even higher by the end of the year. And so you can see what that shortfall represents in terms of what we can then put to capital priorities over that 10-year window. And so for the first time, we are going to be issuing development charge debt that is fully recoverable, but from future DCs. So it's not increasing taxes to do that. But it does create some challenges in terms of flexibility in the long term, in terms of what those growth-related projects can be, having to service that debt. And you see on the graph, debt outstanding, where that blue bar shows a spike, that's essentially modeling what we expect as a realistic scenario in terms of what we'll have to take on in terms of development charges debt. So that sort of sets the stage for some of the conversations we'll have today, and I know Mr. Hagee is going to touch on a number of these things. So certainly we could pause here for questions, or Mr. Hagee can continue, and we could pause at a later time if there are some.
At least one with questions this time. Councillor Johnston.
Thank you, Chair Davey, and thank you, Mr. Lautenbach. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the road projections that we have for road work, and in particular, I look at the one for Avondale Dunbar, and I know that I have residents in that area that had been thinking that this particular road was going to be done sooner. I think it was 2024, 25. It's now 2026, 2027. I'm wondering, I know with our tax increase this year, we're trying to be as conservative as possible. I'm wondering if we can, if you can comment on how we're kind of, or how we make those decisions, and in terms of when roads are done, maybe changing them from where they were before, and how that's affecting kind of how our budget goes up.
Certainly. So through the chair, in the capital forecast, it's sort of, as an indication, other than the current year, sort of indication of planned work. Obviously, as we look at the condition of assets, timing of projects, there's coordination that has to happen sometimes, if it's, regional road, those kind of things. So there's a number of factors that can influence the timing of when you see things within the forecast, both shifting things forward, sometimes shifting things back. So, for the most part, the closer it is to sort of the current year, we try to make sure that we're doing that work. But we also recognize that, as things are identified, that other priorities might, come to the top, and we're working within the funding that we have to do it. So what we've tried to do this year, there is an issue paper that outlines what those changes are. I know in the past we haven't always done that to show those changes, but I think it's an important thing for the public to keep in mind that until we're kind of 1 year out designing whether it's a road, really that forecast can change. It is our best sort of estimate in terms of planned work. There are those factors as we have more data that we look at that influence timing of projects sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if perhaps we can ask the question through an infrastructure perspective, just to reassure people that there, if there's needed work to be done to fill potholes, et cetera, that piece will be done while we're waiting to maybe do those bigger reconstructions.
So through the chair, certainly, I think that work is always ongoing in terms of that maintenance work that has to happen to either extend the life of that asset. Obviously things like pothole repairs is an annual program, so that is something that we do. And in terms of the timing, like within that window of replacing infrastructure, because there are certain things that can influence that timing. It's not putting anything at jeopardy in terms of slight shifts in that. I think it still identifies that those projects that we've identified through the forecast are still priorities. We're still planning to move ahead with them, but you do see those slight shifts. I'm not sure if Ms. McGoldrick wants to add anything other to that.
Ms. McGoldrick.
So through the chair, maybe just to further speak to the maintenance done on roads, and certainly we have a regular road inspection program. We also do condition assessment and adhere to the minimum maintenance standards, and so those are all maintenance works that are underway, regardless of capital investment status.
Thank you, and I understand that we have new abilities to use cameras and to be able to use technology to help us with those pieces now, correct?
Go ahead.
So through the chair, that is correct. We have, we leverage GPS resources as well as camera resources as well to track the work that's done and make better decisions from a maintenance perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you. Just to start off with a quick comment and then my question, but I'll be short. This is really in response to what Councillor Johnston has said. We deal with pressures and concerns from our area residents where they deal with certain infrastructure on a day-to-day basis, and that may not necessarily align with the budgeting, forecasting, as well as the engineering context of the priority of that roadway where it needs to be. And perhaps sometimes it's incumbent on us to really advocate on those key infrastructure items on behalf of our residents, because that's what they expect of us. And so that being said, because our budget process has changed so significantly, where in the past it was really led by council to put forward those very issues through issue papers so it could be hardline articulated exactly as a priority, and then for us to vote on it together. I think going forward, depending on the approach, and if it proceeds to be a collaborative, which I know that Mayor Verbenovich, that is exactly his intent, for council members to be perhaps communicated very early on the budget process, so that we can raise those things on a high level in the early process, as opposed to when the budget is kind of put before council. Because at that point, I think all the things are weighed as a balance, and it's very difficult to make priority changes at a late junction. That being said, the capital budget of $1.8 billion is a significant expenditure over the next 10 years, and again, as a growing city, it's something that we need to do. I think you said it, Mr. Lautenbach, that much of that is probably replacement, repair, or management of our existing infrastructure. Is it challenging for us to spread out, showing exactly what is that and what is all new infrastructure? I know all of us are worse enough to go through this package, but for someone as a layman to see in a very high level of what investment we're making in our capital over the next 10 years.
Yes, so through the chair, at a very high level, I think what you could say is 80% is sort of that replacement piece. 20% roughly, based on the funding that we're providing through development charges as an example, is really that new infrastructure that we're moving ahead with. And so that, at a high level should give you sort of that understanding of, when we talk about the priority being replacement, it is that significant portion of the capital budget.
Okay, and so just again, a lasting comment, and perhaps towards the final budget day, for us to really point out that 20% on the larger items, what they could be, so that the community can come together and celebrate exactly where this council and the mayor, of course, are intent on improving our infrastructure, not only on the management, but also broadening, enhancing, bringing on new infrastructure as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Chair Davey. Oh, one of the comments here where we're talking about our DC debt, things being fully recoverable, but limiting the city's ability to fund future growth-related infrastructure needs. I wonder if you could comment on that a little further. Does this mean like we could have some development stalling because we don't have the funds for the infrastructure needed?
So through the chair, certainly within the next 10 years that we've identified, we have capital projects that we're still planning to move ahead with. So it's not impacting, you know, if anything, it's helping to make sure that those continue in terms of taking on debt to complete those projects. Where there's a bit of unknown right now related to Bill 23 and some of the legislative changes is, you know, the funding shortfalls that we're seeing. You know, the province has made a comment about making municipalities whole. If that doesn't happen, under the current DC framework, it will be challenging to see how can we fund some of those infrastructure costs that typically were 100% sort of recoverable through that framework, which aren't quite the same amount as we move forward. And so when we take on more debt as well, that will limit sort of the funding envelope that will be available for us to think about what those priorities are in terms of new infrastructure to support a growing community. So it's something that we're looking at. We need to bring more information back, obviously related to the impact of, you know, the full legislative changes. There's still some unknowns related to some of the Bill 23 impacts. But what we do know at a very high level is that it is impacting already our ability to move forward with certain projects without using debt as that tool. As we get further out, you know, there may need to be those decisions about what that infrastructure, you know, looks like in terms of those needs and what the funding is available to help support that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just on that point, it might be helpful, like I recall in terms of our major capital projects going forward, we have got that, you know, amazing project going on in the south end of the city. I'm talking about mostly the more discretionary ones, like our community centers and our pools and that sort of thing. After the park is built in the southwest, is there any significant major recreation projects that we need to be worried about going forward?
So I'll turn that question over to Mr. May to respond.
Mr. May?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I suspect, although we will be having to do an updated leisure facilities master plan in the next couple of years, based on what I know today, I'd suggest that once that park is complete, the next thing we'll need to turn our attention to is potentially replacement of ice pads, the standalone ice pads in particular. And I also suspect that that won't be growth related, but rather related to energy and cost. And so it would not be funded from DCs, it would need to be funded from the tax base and other sources.
Great, thank you. That's helpful by way of looking forward, because with our infrastructure issues, at least until we get some better clarification from senior levels of government, sorry, by way of comment, I think it's really prudent that we be very careful about what infrastructure we build and frankly try to build as little additional infrastructure as we can going forward to make sure our books stay balanced. But with that, there's no further questions. So Mr. Haggie, you're taking over.
Thank you. I'll go over some of the capital funding sources. The graphic on the slide shows where our money comes from to fund our capital projects. You can see the largest portion comes from enterprises, and by far it's the water, sanitary, and stormwater utilities, and they're funding a lot of the road reconstruction projects as well as their own standalone water, sanitary, and stormwater projects. We've talked a little bit about the 80-20. You can see on here development charges make up about 18%, so that 80-20 idea of how much is going to replacement versus how much is going to growth holds true. And we've got the capital pool, which is another significant funding source, as well as a few others. We're going to be delving into the capital pool shortly as to what that is and what it funds. We show kind of this year's capital budget versus last year's capital budget, and you can see if you look at the change on the right-hand column, the only large significant change is really in the enterprise section. It's gone up by $165 million, and again, that has a lot to do with the WIP review, the forecasted work to be completed based on the rates that council has endorsed. And so there's a number of projects that we'll see when we get to the capital budget proper that deal with adding in additional cost to existing projects or adding in new projects within the water, sanitary, and stormwater utilities. We've talked, I mentioned about the capital pool, and that's called CC. You may see that in the capital forecast in Appendix C. It's made up of the capital out of current, which is a direct transfer from our operating budget, issuing debt, a transfer from the gas utility investment reserve, and the hydro utility investment reserve. And the capital pool funds a lot of our tax-supported capital replacement projects. It doesn't deal with growth per se, it's dealing with rehab and replacement. And if we're putting anything in or making any adjustments to the capital budget, that's going to have an impact on either other capital projects or other funding sources. And some of them would have an immediate impact, some of them may have a future impact, and we'll get into that. But you can see here, essentially, if we're putting something else in or making any other kind of adjustment, it means that we're going to have to make other choices as far as reserve levels, adding debt or taking away debt, or making adjustments to other capital projects. So we'll move into debt then and talk about it. It's a bit more of a topic this year than it has been the past few. Debt is the city borrowing to fund capital projects, and we can only use it to fund capital projects. Unlike other levels of government, they borrow just to run their operations sometimes. We can only, as a municipality, can only do it to fund capital projects. It's somewhat similar to getting a mortgage on your house. You're borrowing to invest something now, and then you're paying it off over future years. Just a reminder as well, when the city issues debt, it's locked in, and we don't have options to prepay, to renegotiate. Some people do that. They break their mortgage and may, when it's advantageous, do that. If we issue debt, we're locked in for the terms that we agreed to when we issued the debt. And so I know that question comes up from time to time. Could we, get out? We wouldn't want to right now. We have a lot of decent rates locked in. The rates are a lot higher now. But if we were to issue now, we would not be able to renegotiate those rates until the term of the debt comes up. As far as the debt history, you've already seen this graph in Mr. Lautenbach's section. Our debt levels have been declining over the past number of years. You can see in 2024, the new blue bar is being added, and that relates to our development charge debt. We're talking about issuing a significant amount of DC debt, in part related to the new facilities going on primarily in the southwest part of the city, the recreation complex. Another project that would issue for is the Upper Hidden Valley pumping station. So that's a piece of infrastructure we need to unlock lands for development. And as has already been mentioned, we'll issue that debt and it will be fully repaid by future development charges. So it would have no impact on utility rates, it would have no impact on tax rates, but it still is a significant investment that would be paid down over a large number of years. I'll pause there if there are any questions around DC debt. I know we've talked a little bit about it already.
Certainly. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Davey. And Mr. Hagee, I'm wondering, the EDIF debt that was issued, I believe, in the early 2000s. I don't see that there.
2004 to 2013 was.
I'm sorry? It
started in 2004, ended in 2013.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can highlight for us the. And I'm sorry I didn't ask you this ahead of time, but it's due in 2027. Can you give us an idea of the payoff or the what economic benefit we've been able to realize from that fund?
So I don't know that I can. I'm not sure if Mr. Riemann knows that, or there are others that we could. They may need to come in or whatever to discuss it. But it's the EDIF debt is specifically the kind of darker golden or yellow one. So if you look at 2014, I think is the first year in the graph, that darker yellow, and you see it declining as we go across because it's being paid off. In total, it was $89 million worth of debt that was issued for EDIF, a significant investment in our downtown. And I know there are economic spin-offs and benefits of it. I don't have that information myself.
Okay, I don't know if someone does, but it would be great to highlight that if we can.
Sure.
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chair, I can get that for you.
Oh,
We
wonderful.
presented a
Thank
report
you.
a couple years ago. I'm just trying to pull it up right now. So.
You're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, Councillor Johnson, if you just look back a couple of years ago with, I think, upwards to 15 cranes that we had in a downtown, I know you can't, pinpoint all of that towards the economic development strategy, but I would say much of that was stimulus that created that environment for us to have that level of growth, and I think we've reaped the benefits. And I think recirculation of that report will be helpful for this council and new members of council as well to see exactly when you put money in, you get the type of return back. That being said, with the debt, at a high level, looking at it outside the DC debt, it just shows that we're in a very stable debt position as the size of municipality that we are. Could you remind us again, where would we likely fall amongst our peer municipalities in that, when we're looking at the debt outside DCs?
Sure. So we are definitely at generally the lower end of debt issuance per capita or or however you want to cut it. We're definitely on the lower end of that. There are some municipalities that held zero debt positions for a long period of time and then had to take some on because of significant investments that they had to make. We've been managing kind of a downward trend since EDIF. The last EDIF debt was issued in 2013. We've seen that come down. It shows it's stable aside from the DC portion. But I would say that we have a good low debt level generally amongst comparator municipalities.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
No more questions. Please continue.
Sure. So next are development charges, or DCs, as you'll hear them referred to throughout the presentation in the day. There are fees that are imposed on growth with the principle that growth should pay for growth. Existing ratepayers should not need to pay for new facilities that are essentially being done because new people are coming to the municipality. So we need, in some cases, the infrastructure to build and service those homes, like pipes in the ground so that water can come in and out. In other cases, for recreational facilities to service the growing population. The DC Act says what can and can't be done as far as development charges go. We updated our bylaw in 2022 because of some adjustments to the DC Act, and then shortly thereafter, there was another adjustment to the DC Act as part of Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. The changes in Bill 23 supersede what was in place when we were conducting our DC review. It includes things like phasing in DC rates over multiple years. So that means if we thought we were going to charge $50,000 for a home in the first year, we had to reduce that by 20%. And then it's 15%, then 10, then 5. So there's, instead of getting 100% of revenues, we would only get 80, 85, 90, 95, and finally 100% of the rate that we thought we were passing when we discussed this in 2022. There's also some discounts for different types of housing that have been built. And as it's already been mentioned, the estimated impact year to date is $5.5 million. So that's growth revenue that we are not getting because of changes in Bill 23. As has already been discussed a little bit, the province has mentioned that they would make municipalities whole. There's been no further discussion or clarity as to exactly what that looks like, when that is coming, but it's a big dollar amount that we're hoping will come our way at some point in the near future.
If I could, just before you leave that slide, so if I'm understood, just want to make sure we're clear on this. So if making us whole, according to the slide, would essentially mean the province cutting us a check for 2023 for $5.5 million.
Correct.
Thank you.
This slide just shows the projected development charge reserve fund balance. You can see in all years it's negative, and that includes issuing the debt that we've talked about. It's negative in the short term. If this graph were to extend out into future years, we would anticipate that our reserve balance would be positive. So we're okay with it being kind of in this position in the short term, and then correcting itself later off in the forecast. Again, it's in part because of large, complex, costly projects like the Kitchener Indoor Recreation Center and the Upper Hidden Valley Pumping Station in the near term. Those are some big costs, but we also have the revenue decrease because of Bill 23 and other impacts. I'll pause there if there are any other questions. All right.
There are no, oh, wait, sorry, Councillor Dino.
Thank you, Chair Davey. I just have a question about the exemptions for attainable affordable housing. So I'm assuming the affordable housing rate is based on the CMHC of 80% of market?
So my understanding is that there hasn't been full clarity. That's not necessarily fully enforced yet because they have pegged it to some number, but they haven't actually said what that number is.
Okay. Okay, all right. Councillor O'Dooney?
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted clarity around the phrase on, if you go back to the previous slide, please. I must have missed it, how the province is going to make municipalities whole. What does that mean?
We're interpreting it
Compensate
as
for-
the revenues we have lost because of changes due to Bill 23.
Got it.
The province will reimburse us for in some way, shape, or form. We don't know what that is, when that will happen, what form it will be in, any of that sort of stuff yet.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Lautenbach to add?
Yes, so through the chair, and just for clarity, the phrase making municipalities whole is something that the province has actually indicated. And so it is a phrase they've used. And so for clarity, we don't know exactly what that means, but we are assuming that it means all of the costs that changes to legislation have impacted in terms of reduced revenue, that would be funding that would have to come back to municipalities.
If I could, Mr. Lautenbach, or maybe Mayor Verbenovich, you know this, but I recall the actual phrase was from the previous minister. Has the Premier ever echoed that sentiment himself? Do we know? Anyone? Mayor Verbenovich, I'll cue you in.
Yeah, Chair Davey, to be honest with you, I can't recall. I think he may have, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But I will note, and hence why I cued in, was the fact that some have interpreted that the introduction of the BFF fund was one of the steps that would work towards making us whole. But as you know, it's contingent on meeting our objectives in terms of the 35,000 unit housing goal. And, we, like other municipalities, have some concerns in terms of how that's being calculated, because certainly if you calculate it based on the planning approvals that we have done as a city, we're well on our way in terms of meeting those objectives. If you count on it based on the number of building permits and that have been issued and foundations that have actually been built in the ground, we're behind in that regards. But those are things we don't have any control over, and hence why we've corresponded with the minister and the premier and area MPPs on that issue, because we think, as does OBCM and AMO, that those calculations need to be based on something that municipalities actually have control over.
Thank you for that context. Mr. Chapman, Dad?
Through Mr. Chair, just to add to the Mayor's comments, so it's almost a year ago today that the then Minister wrote to AMO to basically outline his view on the issue. And his comment was that municipalities be able to fund road, water, sewer, and other housing enabling infrastructure and services that our growing communities need. And so there was a reference to housing-related infrastructure. And so there is a concern there that may not encompass all areas that were formerly provided for within development charges. And again, it was qualified to municipalities that achieve and exceed their housing pledge levels and growth targets. And so right from the start, there's been a precondition around achieving those levels. And the other factor is that the province had commissioned audits of certain municipalities, and there was an implication that they would want to ensure that those funds were being used appropriately before they would provide additional funding to municipalities. So there are lots of preconditions here, which in the province's mind would need to be satisfied before they would ever come through to provide additional funding.
That's helpful, thank you. Mayor Verbenovich, is that your question as well? Okay. And Councillor O'Dooney is out. Okay, no more questions, please continue.
Next section are reserve funds, which are in Appendix D of our binder. Reserve funds are funds that the city has set aside ahead of time for a specific use. And we'll see that generally reserve levels are positive, but mainly below their target levels. We have a reserve fund policy that outlines some specifics about the reserve funds. It talks about what they will be used for. We've set them aside for intended uses, not just general, free pots of money to use as we in a willy-nilly manner. We've got the idea behind that we want to maintain positive reserve balances wherever possible. Sometimes they would dip down into negatives, but generally having a plan to get them out of that. And each individual reserve fund has its own target level, so we have an idea of where we want to be in any of the specific reserve funds. We've categorized things into 5 different categories and grouped similar type of reserves together for corporate reserves, development-related ones, program-specific, stabilization, and capital reserves. And that's how we'll review them over the next few slides. First are the corporate reserve funds. And for each slide, we've got the similar format. The blue bars at the bottom show the actual projected reserve levels. The red line is the minimum target. The green line is the maximum target. So generally, we would want to see that we're within the red and green bands is the aim that we have. Corporate reserves fund corporate-wide issues, things like insurance, sick leave, learning, development. And you can see that the blue bars are well below the red line. So that indicates that these reserves are below target. They're all collectively have a positive balance over all years of the forecast, but are generally underfunded. Next are the development reserves, which we've already talked about. We do show that we're having negative balances, but as I mentioned before, we would plan that those would become positives in future years. It's just that we're dealing with the significant capital outlays early in our capital forecast, and we would anticipate that that would correct itself in later years. Program-specific reserves fund things that have a narrowly defined scope. Examples include the election, energy retrofit, affordable housing, and the majority of the funding in this category relates to EDIF 2.0. And so while it shows that there's this projected significant balance growing and growing, that's really dependent on land sales, and the timing and amounts are very uncertain, so I wouldn't bank on any of this today, but it is an indication of where we plan to be going over the next few years. Stabilization reserve funds are next. And at the end of the year, when we have an operating surplus or a deficit, it goes into a stabilization reserve, and that gives us a bit of a balance to deal with unexpected things in future years. The graph shows that we're currently within the target range, but that we're moving out of that in the short term. And then you can see it starts to buoy back up out in 2028. A lot of that has to do with drawing down of stabilization reserves, largely in the enterprise areas, based on the rate forecasts that we have. So even with the WIP rate increase, we plan to draw down those, some of the enterprise reserves over the next few years. And finally are the capital reserves. They're used to fund portions of the city's capital program. Again, there's individual reserves for tax and enterprise. We have that on the stabilization side, so we don't commingle funds between the tax-supported side or even any of the enterprises. They each have their own. Similarly, they have their own capital reserve fund. These reserves collectively are staying relatively stable, hovering right around the minimum balance that you see on the screen. So generally, they're decently funded. That's it for this section, Mr. Chair. I'll pause if there are questions on the reserves.
There is just one, Councillor Singh.
Yeah, this is going to come kind of funny for some of the staff that has been around the table of me hearing from me, talking about having too much reserves or too much balances in reserves, and I think the longer you stay, the better realization you have the importance of having the comfort level of dealing with unexpected issues. So that being said, we're seeing, and this is going back to my earlier discussion about the capital expenditures of the $1.8 billion, some of that, 20%, is new infrastructure, new facilities. When we place that, and some of it is driven by growth and so comes from DCs, but again, when the time comes to replace those facilities, that doesn't come again from DCs, that comes from capital occurring, correct?
Correct. We can use DCs to fund new things, but the second we replace it, like version 2.0, it's not DCs, it's funded by other sources, like city sources.
So city sources, so that being said, when we do account for growth on the operating side overall, that growth typically goes towards offsetting operational costs as opposed to capital, correct?
Right, in the tax-supported operating budget, we usually open a new facility, set aside have some growth funding for, utilities, staffing, all that sort of thing.
So with that being said, how are we managing those future expectations? Where we're investing, upwards to, hundreds of millions of dollars in new infrastructure that will one day have to be replaced. How are we better planning for that going forward?
So that's part of the asset management work that we are currently doing right now, understanding our conditions. I believe we could do a better job of setting aside money for, the future replacement and even rehabilitation of components of our facilities. We will be getting much better information because of the work we're doing through our asset management plans.
Okay. I'll just place this more as a comment. I think for us to be responsible, I think we need to know how we're going to replace it, if you want to build it, unless it's absolutely necessary. I think that needs to be on the onset of that outlook of when we are planning on building new infrastructure, not just how we're going to come up with the money to build it, but also how we're going to come up with the money one day to replace it as well.
No further questions or comments. Oh, sorry, Councillor Janot. Just queued in there.
Sorry, thanks, Chair Davey. Just a quick question. Looking into the future, if there is a need for a by-election, will that come from reserves or operating?
So it's unbudgeted. It would likely be, it would probably result in a deficit in an operating area, which would be funded by the tax stabilization reserve if that were required.
Do we have an idea of how much of a cost?
I do not.
Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, should a council seat ever become vacant, there's a process that's outlined in the Municipal Act, so the clerk would come forward to declare the seat vacant. The next report that council would deal with would lay out options in terms of council's approach to fill seats, and that would include a costing. And so I don't recall the exact number, but I believe elections are costing us between $100,000 and $200,000 right now.
The full elections?
Yes.
Like 400,000 or 500,000.
400,000 or 500,000. Okay, it's been a while since I've done one. So you can imagine many of those costs are direct costs associated with polling locations, and so you can do the math to divide that by 10, and it would give you a sense perhaps for the ballpark value of running that election within a ward.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, Mr. Chapman, I think your original estimate was right. I think you were thinking for a by-election because there's a greater cost. But anyway, there are no further questions, Mr. Aggie. Please continue.
All right, the final section of my presentation is just about how to read the capital book. Just give a little reminder of the different pieces and components that you'll see through the capital forecast. We've got things grouped together by department and division. There are little check marks beside new projects to the capital forecast. For larger projects, we've included estimates that, say A, B, or C, and that gives some level of idea of how confident we are in the costing. Again, I want to put the caveat on that we were better at this, and just generally it was better done and true pre-pandemic, where, we're seeing inflation being a lot higher than what we're used to. So when we say A, we generally would mean 5 to 8%. The market seems to be coming in a little more regularly than it has been in the last year or two, but we've included some kind of contingency generally in those larger projects. And if it's an A, it means that we are more confident in the costing for it. If you see a C, it means we're less confident in it. And generally, the ranges are shown here on the screen. As far as the capital forecast, which is in Appendix C, there are 2 issue papers that have, one of them has already been alluded to this morning, or I guess we're in the afternoon, with changes in the timing of road reconstruction projects. That was a request that came through in previous budgets. So we've added an issue paper about the timing and talking about if projects have been moved forward or back and what the cause for that was, just to provide a bit more transparency. And then we had mentioned during operating that we've added $5 million in for facilities management. And there's just an issue paper about that, describing kind of the reason and rationale for that. So this can be found in Appendix F, starting on page 19. If there are any questions about those.
Mayor Verbenovich?
Thanks, and maybe a couple questions, and some for the benefit of the new members of council. When we look at the amounts that are in there for the projects this year, for the projects that have been there before, we've increased those amounts to reflect some inflation, correct?
Correct.
Is there like a common percentage we used across the board, or is it a bunch of different numbers?
So the default, we inflate from year to year by 2%, but as people are identifying projects specifically in year one of the capital forecast, they're identifying it at the cost that they believe it's going to be at to go out to market.
But in reality, by using 2% this year, we know that those numbers have actually gone up by more than that, correct?
Yes, but in a lot of cases we have a funding envelope, so a few $1 million, and then as people are breaking out their specific projects, they've budgeted what they realistically think it will be tendered at.
Mr. Lautenbach, you want to add?
Yeah, and through the chair, we did go through an exercise last year, given that we were seeing significant increases in inflation on capital costs, where we did right-size budgets within the forecast. And so some of that work has already been done in previous budgets in terms of those earlier years of the forecast, in terms of a higher inflation indexing, in terms of those project costs. One thing that we one thing that we saw the benefit of this year was lower tender costs coming in terms of right-sizing those budgets. So I think it has been factored in terms of the 2024 budget and what you're seeing in terms of those project costs that are built into the forecast.
Okay, and so I mean, going forward now, we'll continue to just either, I guess, use that 2% or potentially do another right-sizing, as you've indicated, Mr. Lautenbach?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so through the chair, we'll look at individual projects, and so the ones that will move forward in the current year, we are actually indexing our funding to capital at a much higher rate. So even this year, we increased our contribution by, I believe, 10% compared to what we normally do. So as that funding envelope increases, project costs will be refined to work within that. So I do believe we are indexing at a higher rate than what we traditionally have seen. Obviously, hoping that inflation does come down to that 2% level, which historically has been relevant pre-pandemic.
Okay, and when we talk about the projects that are also receiving provincial and federal funding, and I suspect I know the answer to this, but where it's a percentage of where either we're like matching or whatever, the reality is if the project cost has gone up, the province or the feds have not given us more money as a result of that. Is that correct?
So through the chair, that's correct. Unfortunately, much of the grant funding that we've received for some of our projects, indexing hasn't happened on that, even though inflation has ratcheted up costs in the last couple of years. And so that does represent a shortfall in terms of what that percentage split would have been, has shifted as a result of grant funding not keeping pace in terms of those inflationary adjustments.
Okay, and maybe like either you or Mr. Chapman, through your respective associations, the financial association and the NCAMA, or the Ontario version of those, do we have any sense if this is a topic of conversation with the federal or provincial governments?
Mr. Lautenbach?
So through the chair, I certainly know that this topic has come up in terms of being raised, in terms of indexing of grant funding. My understanding is there hasn't been movement on this, at least that I'm aware of, at least to this point. And certainly it's an issue that we can continue to advocate for through various associations that we're a part of.
Okay, thank you. And so I guess the only other point that I would make is, this issue of the deficit challenge that we as municipalities face was a big part of FCM's advocacy days last week in Ottawa, and the need for a new fiscal framework to recognize that You know, as cities, we're dealing with 21st century challenges with 19th century legal and financial frameworks, and quite frankly, it just doesn't cut it when we talk about homelessness, housing, addictions, mental health, the inflationary pressures and so on that we're all dealing with. And, you know, the billions that are going to be needed in infrastructure investments, both in terms of managing the existing infrastructure stock that we have, as well as the new stock that's required for growth to deal with all the new housing, the 5 million new homes that we know are needed across Canada and so on. This is going to be a real challenge that's going to require a new relationship amongst all orders of government to tackle.
Thank you, Mayor Rubinowitz. This is an important point. Just before we continue, Mr. Haggie, just for the benefit of the new members of council that are here, if you could just go back 2 pages. Right, one more. Yeah, so I did have a question earlier about what the funding is, and I know you explained it well, but I think just, again, as a first-time councillor, I found a lot of it overwhelming, but this is kind of like the guideline in all those pages that you flip. So, for example, if you're looking at a road that's being constructed and it says, if you're wondering whether it has a sidewalk or not, like as part of the infill, it would have that TS under that type column, okay? So just in case you're ever curious what's funding it and what's included, this is the page that would guide you towards it. But those are all the questions. Mr. Haggie, please continue.
So the remainder of the slide deck is just a bit of a guide as far as if we're flipping through. We've highlighted the changes that are over $250,000. Mr. Chair, this is normally where you'd indicate a chunk of pages that would be discussed, and if there are any questions, various staff will try to respond to them.
For sure. So why don't we just do it like this, committee? So I will leave it on a page for 30 seconds or something. If someone has a question on the item on the screen, then you would queue in, and after 30 seconds, I'll just ask to change the next slide. Okay. So any questions on this? The item on the screen, Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, and I think it's helpful to look at the top of each slide. So in this case, it says boards and general expense, CAO pages 3 to 5. So that would correspond to pages or Appendix C3 to Appendix C5 in your capital budget package.
Thank you. Just give folks another moment to take a look. And don't worry if we miss something at the end, I'll be asking if there's anything that was missed, and you can come back and ask those questions afterwards. But I'm not seeing any. Please, next slide. Certainly. A bit more time has been requested. Yeah. Councillor Deneau.
Thanks, Chair Davey. C18, Bud Park Indoor General Provision. What does that funding entail, or that money entail, Mr. May?
Mr. May.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that would entail any small projects that are required within the indoor facility. We do offer some limited direct sport programming out of that facility, and so need to maintain it.
So can I make a suggestion? The Wi-Fi in there is awful. Like it's actually, you can't even get a connection inside that venue. Are we able to make it better?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe, coincidentally enough, our director of TIS is here. I don't know if he can speak to it. If not, we can take it away and certainly take a look at it. Sorry, Dan.
Through the chair. So it's interesting. This was actually raised by, I believe it came through a patron of the facility, and it was raised. So there's some conversations looking at the ability to service that facility. There is one caveat that would come with that. We generally will not put in public Wi-Fi in any facility unless it has a fiber-based connection to our main network. That facility currently, I think, has a very small connection just to facilitate the, I think there's some maintenance staff that manage that facility, so we would have to, there'd be about an $8,000 to $10,000 cost for RepNet connection, and then obviously the equipment and networking required to put Wi-Fi in that facility, but it is something that just recently got raised as a question, can we do this? So we will look at what that cost would be, and as part of our Wi-Fi that we've been putting in all our other facilities, and it sounds like that facility is now a city-owned facility as well, and there's a lot of parkland around there that could benefit from that, so it's certainly something we can bring that information back.
It wasn't me that made that. I'm just letting you know. But yeah,
I think it actually came from the public, so.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Councillor O'Dooney.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm starting out at Appendix C8, and as I'm looking through just a list of requests for fire, I guess the fire chief is not here. Okay. As we intensify in the downtown core and we're building up a lot more, I just want to confirm that the additional fleet vehicles and the equipments that we're either purchasing or replacing, will they be, with the challenge of skyscrapers, is that something that we're ready for moving forward, or should that be something that could be added here if needed?
Mr. Mayor.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the biggest issue with responding to high-rise fires is the ability to get staff on scene quickly. And so back in 2021, Council approved a new fire station to be located in the downtown. That'll be the single greatest thing we can do. I can confirm that the equipment and vehicles are within the budget to support that additional station. There is some question around the type of vehicle, which will likely come back to Council in 2024. But yes, we will have that well served.
Mr. May, just to clarify if I could you comment, this is a question for the fire chief, we can park it for another time, but this is a question I've had raised by residents a lot with our intensification of the downtown. Can you comment, even anecdotally, on the relative incidence or danger of fires occurring in modern high-rises versus the older infrastructure? If you can't, that's okay.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair, I will have the fire chief respond and copy all of council. What I will say is the new buildings are built to a very high standard in terms of sprinklers, which makes them in some cases even safer than the older buildings.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Dooney, Councillor O'Dooney, please continue.
I still have a few I wanted to ask. Moving over to Appendix C11, I'm just looking at one of our community centers, 5 years of, I guess, the money increasing, and then 2027, 2028 is much larger. I know that's much further ahead. I'm just wondering, I thought usually these things are spread within 2 years, but seeing it spread over 5 years, just trying to get a better understanding of what's going on there. And if I need to meet with someone from finance to get a better understanding, because it seems a bit more technical, then.
Sorry, Mr. Haggie.
Sure, the funding that's shown for Forest Heights, the first 3 years are different planning, like feasibility study, design, like conceptual design, detailed design, and then the two larger amounts in 2027, 28 are for the actual construction.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you. Councillor Michaud. No, it's actually happening a lot, folks. People, as they're signing, I know we're signing a lot of things, the blinker light's going off a bit here. Councillor Singh.
I'm sorry, I think my binder was the cause of it, but I'll queue in for the next item, though.
Sounds good. Mayor Rubanovich.
Thanks. Just one question, and I'm guessing it's probably too early that we would have factored this into the budget, but I know there is federal funding coming up where we can do assessments of some of our buildings, and then actually get federal funding to do upgrades on those buildings from an energy point of view, as Canada strives to meet its climate change objectives. Has that been factored into any of these projects? And if not, do we see this as an opportunity to potentially get some additional dollars to help us with work that we otherwise would have been planning anyway?
Ms. McGoldrick.
So through the chair to the mayor, we have factored in the opportunity to apply for the funding, and so I'm just flipping my pages because it's under facilities management, under the energy management plan. But that funding is going to be utilized to apply for those grant opportunities in addition to providing the city contribution.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No further questions. Next slide, please. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I expect the answer, but I'll ask it nonetheless. So, seems to be a significant increase to the license to the software. Are they the only game, or is there anyone else other than GIS?
Through the chair, the software licensing is Esri, which is really I'll say the only commercial product that's viable for what we use here. We have looked at open source software at various times in the past, but a lot of the software we have, like CityWorks, that does our work order management, is based on the Esri platform. So it is a very significant...
so if you were to change it, it would be a huge undertaking.
It would cost a lot more than what we're asking for here to maintain the...
So would we question ourselves at a point where we are making a transformative change from our city operations, which uses the GIS data?
So I'm not aware of any other products that are out there that are using any alternative underlying software. Esri really is kind of the market leader in that, and there's not a whole lot else available.
So that being said, I'm not talking about it as part of this budget, but perhaps as a long-term conversation. When we have aerial data, we have the land registry data, that's really GIS range outlining where the property boundaries are, and the infrastructure that's laid out. Could we adopt a system of our own over time? Again, going back to kind of AI, as there's more abilities for us to create transformative software within our existing data, is that something that perhaps we could look at down the road?
It's something that we've looked at, leveraging open source software. I think creating a whole another package of our own wouldn't really be of any benefit. The biggest issue, and it's kind of like the same challenge we have with Microsoft, we have so many integrations that exist with the software we have that we're kind of bound, unfortunately, to certain vendors. Moving from those would require considerable, change of other software that's related to it.
Okay, all right. So it's a pain that we all share, not just the City of Kitchener.
That's correct, yep. All the local municipalities use the same software as well. It's common in every municipality.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Councillor Deneau.
Thank you, Chair Davey. Excuse me, C23 for the Reconciliation Action Partnership and the RISE. I noticed there's just 1 year of funding. I noticed there's just an allocation for 2024. I'm just curious how come, like most of them, there are a few other monies allocated in future years.
Ms. McGoldrick.
So through the chair to Councillor Deneau, I can speak about the Reconciliation Action Partnership funding. So that is the city's share of the Reconciliation Action Partnership as part of the 2024 work plan. The ongoing funding needs will be better defined, and that will be done through engagement with Indigenous communities and leaders across the region. And so we didn't allocate monies past 2024 until we had better certainty in terms of what the ongoing costs would be.
Okay, so we'll see, starting next year, money's allocated for future years, I'm assuming?
That's correct, yes.
And the RISE?
And sorry, Mr. May, for the RISE?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So RISE was a time-limited pilot project that was approved by Council. If I recall correctly, Council actually added additional funds through last year's budget. My understanding is the report will come back in 2024 that will look at the program, and Council can make a decision at that time about funding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh.
Mr. Chair, sorry, it was my misunderstanding. I didn't realize that we could go on other items outside of the issue paper. So I missed out on C12, if you would allow it. Just,
Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah, so C12, outdoor winter rinks. So this seems to be a higher item for 2024, and then this, almost half going in consecutive years after. We're just trying to do more, or are we trying to do some of those non-ice rinks?
Mr. Mayor.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is actually the result of an approval by Council through last year's budget. I don't recall the exact number. I think it was the addition of 4 additional rinks. If not 4, it was in that ballpark.
Okay, but we're not looking at any of those like non-ice surfaces, right?
No, so we actually own 2 of those, and staff are actually contemplating how we can start to use those year-round in other ways.
Is there a report that's coming based on our usage and experience of using those 2 surfaces?
That'll depend on what the outcome is and what the intended use is.
Okay, so in the future then, maybe we get some more information?
Yep.
Okay, all right. And the other one is on us. I think it's the same one. On the ice rink. I don't remember write it down. On the new arena study. Mr. May, perhaps sorry, I don't recall exactly which page it was. New arena, C15. Can read my own handwriting. C15, new arena study, 312. I know I'm nitpicking, but I mean, that's a large item to do a study. Is there ways to do it cheaper? Or?
So through you, Mr. Chair, this was something that was committed to by Council a number of years ago, and it's an ice demand study that's funded through DCs. And so because of COVID, we delayed it. It is time to go out and take a look at, what are the trends locally in terms of ice demand growth.
Okay, so with that, will we look at utilization of software that we can get more effective scheduling so that we can better utilize existing services that we have, or broadening the time so that we can get more groups in?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we first need to collect the data to determine if there is a greater demand than there has been.
Okay.
The issue of scheduling of ice is one that staff is constantly looking at, and for the most part, it is the responsibility of our ice partners to actually schedule the specific. They just block ice with us, big, large blocks. But it is an issue we continue to try to raise with them.
So we can learn how we can better utilize the facilities that we have, as well as perhaps outlining if we need more.
Oh, so through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. My intention with this study is to look at how we can use our existing rinks creatively to meet any demand.
Awesome, thanks. I'm sorry for nitpicking.
No further questions. Next slide, please. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, on C32 for downtown improvement. Are we encouraging the downtown BIA to, work with their membership better to increase investments as opposed to the continual reliance on the tax base towards improvements?
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chair, so staff have been working with the Downtown BA over the last few years to really level set, especially in the response to coming out of COVID-19 and making sure that we're strategically working together as much as possible to implement a really strong downtown.
Okay, I think that question probably comes with a bit of a comment. I think that's where we need to partner better and provide data that we have. At the same time, put them on notice to do more. C45, payments surface treatment. So this is resurfacing, right? Resurfacing of our like a roads, right?
Yes. Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that was my assumption. So with that, are we looking at speeding the time? This goes back to earlier comments, not just by me, other members of council. You know, I think we're doing really well as a community of bringing on new infrastructure, new amenities, but at the same time, you know, sometimes we fall short on focusing on the meat and potatoes of stuff that we already have. Are we looking or gathering data as to the number of complaints that we get? How far behind are we in speeding up with the resurfacing and improving the overall condition of our roadways?
Through the chair, so we use our asset management program to identify the roads most in needs, and so we had actually found a couple years ago that we were a lot higher than the benchmark for Ontario municipalities, and so council did slow down the resurfacing slightly to make sure that we could accommodate some other works at the time, and so we still are much higher above the benchmark for pavement quality index than other municipalities, and so we are keeping an eye on that as we move forward.
Okay, and our future environics or surveys that we conduct with our constituents, we will look to gather that data too, just to get a sense of their overall satisfaction, beyond, of course, looking at more of the the engineering and more of the data. The way we collect it is based on a correlation with the peer communities, but again, getting a sense of how well are we doing in satisfaction of our residents.
Through the chair, that's something that I can take back to the team to talk about in future survey iterations if there's a question there that we would focus on. But we do use a provincial standard for pavement quality index, which gives us a very good understanding of what our quality of our asphalt looks like.
Yeah, it's just always better to get it from the word, from the mouth, those that pay for it. Are we doing well enough? The last one I have is on page C48, cycling infrastructure. Yeah, that includes this as well. Now, the 700,000, what's in 2024 will be the completion of the downtown cycling grid, correct?
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chair, that is correct. That is the allocation right now, is to complete the downtown grid, and it's primarily through DC funding.
But it's a continuation throughout the capital forecast, 10 years, approximate 700,000 across the board, and the other 700,000 in future years. Or consecutive 700,000. Will that be primarily for cycling, but will that have a combination of trails and cycling?
Through the chair, so this is the on-road cycling portion. Trails is in infrastructure services, and so a portion of this is development charge collected, and so we have to make sure we're mindful of that in the projections as well.
Do we know what the split is?
Yeah, through the chair, it's 2/3 DCs and 1/3 city portion, and that 1/3 needs to be accommodated because we can't collect 100% DC to implement the DC portion.
So the bulk of it is DC funded then?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, all right. And we outline and articulate that well enough to the community when they say, hey, you're wasting my tax dollars with putting these cycling lanes. They know that it's really primarily being funded with new growth.
Through the chair, that was the message last year as well through the budget process. So I don't know how many people actually watch our budget meetings or I don't recall reporting being on it at the time. But we're also always looking for grant opportunities as well from other levels of government to help fund our infrastructure. And so we've been fairly successful over the past few years to be able to do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Deneau?
DC has the question. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Chair Davey. C32, the downtown improvements and the downtown incentives funding. I'm just curious what that actually entails. Are they together or are they separate from each other?
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chairs, the downtown improvements funds like our infrastructure replacements that we have to do, so new bike racks, benches, repairs to planters, things like that, and then the downtown incentives typically does things like the facade grant improvements. So we work with business owners to incentivize improvements to their facades to improve the look and feel of downtown.
Okay, so that includes like their signage outside their stores?
Through
like the facades?
Yeah, through the chair, and so there's eligibility requirements for it, and so I'm not sure if it includes signage, but it includes things like refacing, window replacements, door replacements, things like that, to bring the quality of the facade up to a better standard.
Now, is there usually a high uptake in that funding historically?
Through the chair, we do have quite a few applicants come through that program.
Okay. Okay, and so the BIA, does that contribute to any other portion of our funding as well? Can businesses apply for funding through the BIA as well, or is this completely separate?
Through the chair, so the BIA has their own budget that they manage, and so we do provide some contribution to it in exchange for things like horticultural improvements and things like that. They fund things like the patio program, so those standardized patios were acquired by the BIA through that.
Okay, and just a quick question, how closely do we work alongside the downtown BIA? Like, are we in partnership, or are we kind of just go along the same path, and if our paths cross, then we work together?
Through the chair, so we do meet with them regularly, so staff do attend to their BIA meetings. Okay. We've had representatives on our Downtown Vision project, and so we look to work with our BIAs because we all have the same interest in making sure that we have high quality business areas in our city, and so we have the two BIAs, this one and the Belmont Village BIA as well.
Okay, and I guess just to comment onto that, and I believe I CC'd you on the email last week, you know, the website for the downtown Kitchener portion of restaurants and businesses is very outdated. And so I think, you know, we as a city and they as a BIA, we have to stay on top of that because there are businesses that have been closed for a couple of years now. And so, you know, I was quite surprised to see that last week on the website. And then my last one, I think it was kind of already answered, C48, the cycling infrastructure. So the 2/3 that comes from DC, that has to go to the cycling infrastructure?
Through the chair, yes. So the 2/3 is funded through DCs, but it's also funded for the inner neighborhoods, which is the neighborhoods inside the expressway. And so we can't use that funding elsewhere, like outside of that boundary. And so we just have to make sure we're applying it in the right locations per the DC Act.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Johnston.
Thank you, Chair Davey. And I just wanted to ask about the small-scale traffic calming, the neighborhood speed reduction, etc. So these are the areas that have the smallest amount of budget going towards them. But they're, from what I hear from, well, definitely from what my experience is and my fellow councillors' experience, that is the thing that we hear about the most from residents, is about slowing traffic down in neighborhoods and across the city. The neighborhood speed reduction, for one thing, it looks like there's only a budget item for 2024 and then nothing beyond that. Wondering if we can comment about what's looking to be us not putting money into the places where we're receiving the most concerns.
Through the chair, so that was a temporary program to change the speed limit signs in all of our neighborhoods. We did the 40-kilometer-an-hour pilot, and then council had authorized us to implement 40 kilometers an hour in neighborhoods across the city. And so this is the final, that $184,000 in the neighborhood speed reduction program is to finish the implementation of that program, and then that program is complete. The small-scale traffic calming, that $19,000 that's allocated there, we do also pull from the traffic calming budget. So the estimate is it's about $80,000 to install and remove all of the flexi signs that Kitchener has approved over the last few years annually, and so we do draw from that account as well as the top line account. In addition to that, Council had approved our Complete Streets program, which looks at how we design our streets for all users with safety in mind. And so we have a few of those projects currently coming online right now, and I can share a whole list of projects, but if you look at the capital forecast pages for all of the full road reconstructions for engineering, every single one of those projects will go through a Complete Streets analysis and will implement specific traffic calming measures that's appropriate for those streets. And so that's a way for council to really implement traffic calming across the city in the most effective and efficient way possible.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, maybe it's a bit of a misnomer then to call the traffic signs the neighborhood speed reduction, but I appreciate that explanation. So what you're saying then is that the majority of neighborhood speed reduction is under traffic calming, correct?
Or through full road reconstruction. So in 2023, Bruce Street, Conway Drive, Highland Road East, Mackenzie Avenue, Rosemount Drive, Sherwood Avenue, Patricia Avenue, 2nd Avenue, Rossford Crescent, Margaret Avenue, and Franklin Avenue all underwent complete streets design and have traffic calming features implemented into them.
And sorry, just to help too, I would offer, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Reedman, but we're probably talking about like many millions of dollars in incremental costs for complete streets in terms of traffic calming as well there.
Correct. Council is, investing a lot in traffic calming across the city. When we look at the full road reconstruction list, there's about 7 or 8 pages of projects there, and so all of those will get significant treatment. So we used to only do 2 streets a year when I actually started here 10 years ago. We upped that to 3, and now we're doing, dozens of streets per year.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Dooney.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm looking through this list. I don't know where this will fall, but the number one complaint that, apart from traffic and how people drive on the streets, another complaint that I tend to get a lot of is dirt on the streets and streets not being cleaned. And I wanted to just get feedback. Is there anything that could be done, or perhaps I think I wrote down here, can we purchase street sweepers? But I feel like that is like the last straw of what can be done. But are there steps before I can ask for something like that?
Ms. McGoldrick.
So through the chair to Councillor O'Dooney, to your point about street sweepers, the city does have street sweepers and regularly sweep streets, but I think perhaps the issue that you're referring to is related to construction practices that may put excessive materials on the road, and in that case there are erosion and sediment control requirements for new developments. And certainly we're looking to always improve those best practices. That would be kind of a construction inspection consideration. But we do have a rigorous street sweeping program, and I'm recently partnered with Bloomberg in terms of reviewing that practice to make sure that it is equitable and data-driven in terms of the service level.
Thank you. How many street sweepers do we currently have in terms of our inventory as a city?
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Reedman, you wanted to add before that question?
Yeah, through the chair, and so also in Mr. O'Dooney's ward, a lot of the dirt is from new construction, and so that is a developer responsibility to maintain street sweeping when the dirt is created by their subdivision developments, and so we work with them to make sure that the roads are cleaned up as quickly as possible, recognizing there's significant active construction zones that are underway.
Right, so, yeah, so...
We can't really step in until after they fully hand it over to the city, am I correct?
Certainly, if you're seeing excessive, Councillor O'Dooney, I would, again, contact staff and report those streets, for sure. Mr. Reedman, you want to add?
Okay. Yes, through the chair, and so typically roads or new subdivisions are on maintenance by the developer for 2 years before we accept them, and so during that time it is the developer's responsibility to maintain those assets.
And sorry, there's a question about the number of street sweepers we have, and I recall, Ms. McGoldrick, we added a fancy high-tech one recently. Do we receive that yet?
Okay, I'm looking over to our Director of Fleet and Director of Operations, Roads and Traffic. So we have received the new sweeper that Council approved the purchase of, so that is good news. And we currently have 4 sweepers within our inventory.
4 sweepers, okay. And when I say fancy, I should add too that they were, sorry, I recall that one. It was, I don't remember the exact specifics, but it was certainly more efficient and better for the environment as well. So, up next, Councillor Michaud.
Thank you. I'm just going to piggyback on Councillor Johnson's comments with regards to the traffic calming and the neighborhood speed reduction. I'm looking at this paper, and up to 2023, there is still a significant difference between the amount of dollars we're putting into traffic calming and neighborhood speed reduction compared to the cycling infrastructure. So it was my understanding that the last piece, the big piece for cycling infrastructure is what we're doing in the downtown core. So my question is, why are we continuing to advance the cycling infrastructure more than the traffic calming and the neighborhood speed reduction, when I think most of the councillors around the horseshoe here, the number one concern they have is speeding in their neighborhoods, and they're asking for more traffic calming and more supports.
Mr. Eamon?
Yeah, through the chair, and so the downtown grid was the priority project for the Cycling and Trails Master Plan. The Cycling and Trails Master Plan was a 25-year document to recommend implementation of cycling and trail infrastructure across the entire city. We know that trails are disconnected and they need to be connected with all ages and abilities infrastructure. In the downtown, it's a lot more complicated to install this type of infrastructure because we have very narrow road right-of-ways. But in more of the suburban wards, it's a lot more easy to do that with limited traffic impacts, and that also functions as traffic calming as well. So the project that, the main project that's identified for next year through the funding that's indicated in the budget is the River Road cycling infrastructure that's planned to connect to Spine across the whole city. Through that reconstruction. So there's wide boulevards on the side, so as we get into the design, it's likely going to be a multi-use path that's installed there, but that connects a number of trails across that whole area of the city, which is sort of vacant from active transportation infrastructure. But going back to the full road reconstruction, like that is the significant opportunity, and that was a change that was made about 2 years ago by this council to really implement traffic calming more effectively across the city. And so when we look at the road reconstruction projects, they're specifically identified there. We had also put forward a $300,000 recommended implementation for enhancing trail crossings, and so specific locations were identified in an email that was sent to council on Friday, and they are mostly in suburban wards to make sure that we have safe access across trails, and those are also functioning as traffic calming measures.
And thank you for that explanation, and I can appreciate all the work that staff does to keep our streets as safe as possible, but I'm not hearing from my residents in Ward 4 since I became on council, so I'm 5 years into this almost, and I'm still here. The biggest complaint I have is speeding and traffic calming needs. So I'm wondering if we can't maybe take another look at the method that we're doing for traffic calming and ways to enhance it so that the residents who are experiencing this in their neighborhoods can see some kind of a change, because everything you said, Mr. Redmond, is maybe factual, but the residents aren't seeing that. All they're seeing is speeding and erratic driving on their streets in their neighborhoods, and I think they feel like they're falling on deaf ears.
Mr. Chapman, you want to add?
Through the chair, I appreciate council's interest in this issue. It's come up consistently through the budget discussion, and so it may not be a solution for the 2024 budget, but I think one thing that is important is to paint the big picture in terms of all of the investments across all of the funding streams, across all of the wards, perhaps even to map it so that we can indicate what work has been completed, what work is planned. Because I agree, when you go line by line, some of the amounts look small, and there's a whole larger context here. And then certainly council will have that full picture, and that can form part of our discussion as a part of the upcoming budget process. I do want to point out that the cycling work will look very different. I think about site visits that Councillor Schneider and I have been on in his ward, and the River Road connection. You've talked at length with me, at least, about the trail connection along River Road, and so that is the work that will be funded through cycling infrastructure, and that will be an off-road network for all ages and abilities. It will look more like a trail than it will like on-road cycling infrastructure. And so I would agree with Mr. Reedman that as we complete the work in 2024, that closes a chapter on the program, and it will look different starting in 2025. But through the chair, we'll take that away, I think, and again, not for final budget approval, but to be able to paint the picture for council in terms of where all the investments are planned, and that can form the basis for further discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful, especially including the investment with respect to complete streets. Mr. Reedman?
Yeah, through the chair, I just wanted to add one other point. Through the new subdivisions, they are required to implement our complete streets protocols, and so we will see the new subdivisions that are coming online be designed as complete streets with traffic calming features tied right into them as well.
Thank you. Mayor Rabinovich.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone for their commentary on this issue, because I share the concerns and the frustrations, quite frankly, that we see in terms of people's driving behaviors. And I would say, post-COVID, they've gotten worse. I think is fair to say. I don't know if people's frustrations on that and other issues are simply playing out on the road or what, but it is a concern. There are certainly things that we can do from a design and perspective and so on, and I think as staff have outlined, there's some work that we have done and other work that needs to happen. But there's also an enforcement piece on this, right? And you know, quite frankly, you know, while I understand there's competing pressures, we also need to remind Waterloo Regional Police Service that there's an enforcement component here. I think the other thing to keep in mind is as the region's traffic and our own speed zones in schools get implemented over the next couple of years, that will actually see cameras at every school. That will not only have an impact in those areas, but should, in theory, slow people down a little bit in general. But I guess only time will tell in terms of how that plays out. But I'm glad that Mr. Chapman suggested what he did, and I think as we look ahead to budget 2025, I think taking a comprehensive look at this to reflect this will be helpful and bring that back early in the process.
Thank you, Councillor Ioannidis.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Davey, and thanks everyone for this great discussion. I think for clarification for staff when they take this back, I think one of the things that council is actually kind of wanting to ask for is tools at our disposal that we can use at our discretion, and that's where I think my colleagues are leaning towards, and so I would hope that we can look at those types of options.
Just for clarification, Mayor Rabinovich?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Councillor Ioannidis, are you talking about like more signage, more of those little radar speed things that you could put into different neighborhoods at different points in time? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
I would classify those as those items, yes. And if there's anything new in the toolbox in the last 4 or 5 years or whatever that can be implemented, I don't know. Like, I mean, I know we have a huge network that throughout the city that I don't know we could be maybe leveraging. I don't know.
Okay.
Whatever.
No, that's helpful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add to then, because we heard from Mr. Cronkite too that doing additional work in this space will most certainly require additional staff. It's going to require a more comprehensive look into this, which I think is more appropriate for the 2025 budget going forward. Councillor Michaud, do you want to clarify?
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you. I agree with Councillor Ioannidis on those parts, but I also want to thank Mr. Mayor for bringing up the regional police services. I will speak for Dune South in particular. I'm not sure that any sign, slow down sign in some areas of Dune South would help. I think there needs to be more enforcement out there, so I'm hoping that we can bring that to them. Thank you.
Thank you. And for a second round, Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just didn't want to miss out the opportunity of speaking and advocating regarding better safety of our neighborhood streets. And I just want to try to reflect the conversation from my colleagues on something that we did deal with. And this is something specifically I did bring up during my meeting with Mr. Chapman. And I was confused when looking at this budget and seeing the 19,000, whatever the number is, in the small scale speed calming as an issue. If you recall, and I think all of us, including what Councillor Ioannidis has just said about the tools within the hands of members of council, because we're best able to know exactly where that immediate response is required, is the fact that the hotspot measures was brought forward, and I think there was overwhelming support, and that's the way to go, and looking at hard infrastructure changes to a road network that forces people to slow down. But it was the ask and want of this council, it's a comment, but I'll stay within my 4 minutes, that we want additional investments in more proactive, we all said this, more proactive, quick response, speed calming measures. And then we put in the 100,000. So understandably, we did get that extra delineators, there was an ask and want for us to be able to purchase more radars as well, so that it's not just one that is, a couple that spreads around the city, but each ward is able to have a resource available to them. So again, I'm hoping that staff can articulate of how that direction was taken that last year. Because if you assume that 100,000 and 100,000 into the base budget, that's far more than the 19,000 being included in the capital, apart from the operating that's required. The last bit that I want to say is those delineators on their own don't work. When it's just a single delineator in the middle, in the median of the roadway. But I have seen anecdotally, even from my own personal use of driving through them, is that when you have three on each side, so it's a narrowing specifically, people are forced to slow down. And our cost to put in and take out isn't going to be substantively increased when it's three as opposed to moving away from single in middle roadway, because we're going to be at that spot anyways. If you install one, if you install three, if you remove one, if you remove three, the cost would be only a small increase. So I'm hoping staff can take a look at the conversation from past year and really base this budget on that intent. That intent that 100,000 extra was supposed to go towards the small-scale traffic calming measures.
Thank you. No further questions? Please continue. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, this is for Countryside C60 DMAF funding. It's put in for 2026. Just wanted to get some assessment from staff. Is there ability to bring that up? I mean, we did reach out for comments from the community. I know we just recently had a neighborhood input session. The only reason I ask is the park improvement is really now tied more specifically to that DMAF work that's required in that park. And I think it makes sense to do that, to capture both. But I think initially we were looking at doing that 2024, 2025. Now we're looking at it being pushed off, if staff can comment, and if there's a way for us to accelerate that.
Yeah. Mr. Lamb.
And thank you through the chair. Thank you, Councillor Singh, for the question. With respect to the DMAF programs, we are actually entering into significant engagement with our community members, which is really what is causing a slight delay in the program. What we have done in the past is engagement through one or two project information centers, but we've actually, through the community feedback, have extended that to 2 or 3. And that's to gather the proper input to ensure that residents have say in the ultimate designs that are put forward, and to ensure that the infrastructure that is put in place ultimately does serve the needs of the community. That unfortunately means that we have had to delay that project by 1 year as we progress through those steps.
Now, 2 sessions have happened for that specific park, correct? I took part in one, another one just happened last week that I had a conflict with my schedule. I couldn't, but 2 have happened already, right?
My understanding is that is correct. 2 have happened, but I believe the first one was the introductory to the project, and we haven't actually gone through the design phase of that yet. So we still do need to go through a more extensive design phase engagement with the community members before we are able to proceed with the actual design.
Is there a way for us to move forward and accelerate some of this? And it doesn't have to be, articulated in this budget. We could perhaps point it out in 2025. But is there a way to speed that process up?
Through the chair. So right now, I believe there's 6, if not 8, engagements going on with multiple different projects. That is all being done concurrently as part of the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. What we're trying to do is keep those projects as in line as possible to meet the end program date of the program. So one of the things that we are anticipating and concurrently doing is advancing all those engagements at the same time, recognizing that every community and every area is looking to advance their infrastructure projects at the same time as well. We are doing our best to advance the Country Hills engagement, and we will be proceeding with the current plan as stated. And unfortunately, that does mean that there is a slight delay in it.
Okay, well, that could be future conversation, and thank you for correcting me. It's Country Hills, not Countryside. Countryside was the other item that was in the list. And Countryside Park has, I think, 150,000, if I recall, as an item for this year. Is that part of the engagement consultation, or is that actual some improvements that would start to happen?
No, those funds are largely for the design, to bring on a design consultant. So to incorporate some of the feedback that we're hearing from the community into the design that we were able to present.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
No further questions? Next slide, please. Going once. Going twice. Sold. Okay. No questions on this as well. I believe that brings us to... Does that bring us to the end? Sorry, no questions on any of these? Okay, that brings us to the end then. So this is the point where I would ask if there were any questions that were that were otherwise missed during the Capital Budget Committee meeting. Now would be the time to ask those questions. I would also offer, since we have a little bit of time, this is the last public opportunity for committee to provide input publicly to the mayor before he brings forward his budget. Certainly you can meet with him individually or separately between now and the upcoming deadline, but if there's any aspects with respect to operating that you would like to raise now, now would be the time, as the deadline is, again, I just don't have it in here, but the mayor's proposing December 4th, but staff can remind me of that. Mayor Rabinovich.
Thanks, Chair Davey. Actually, one question that I forgot to ask earlier, and that's on all the DMAF projects in the stormwater utility. I'm just making sure, I mean, there's a lot of money that's on the table from that project, $49.9 million, and I just want to make sure that we're tracking in terms of all the projects that we're doing to make sure that no money gets left on the table and we're using all of it and achieving everything we need to get every last cent of that.
Yeah. And through the chair, we are doing everything we can to make sure that we are going to claim the full amount from the federal government.
Awesome. And I mean, I guess this is a good time to thank them again for that very significant contribution. I know it's one of the things we're advocating for because that fund was significantly oversubscribed, and we were one of the early municipalities to get money, and that was a significant amount. It was sort of the last threshold before it needs to go to Treasury Board for approval. So we were lucky to get that amount, but obviously that luck goes along with the very compelling application that our staff put forward. The other issue, and Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if you're bringing this forward or am I, the issue of the Humane Society?
I'm chairing, so I guess I can't bring it forward.
Okay. Well, it's really more a question or a request from staff. I think a number of members of council have heard from the Humane Society. They're also going to be formally putting a request into the region, City of Kitchener and City of Waterloo, in terms of their expansion that's needed to support the community going forward. In terms of us, my understanding is they're going to be looking for, I believe it's $300,000 over a 3 to 5 year time period. I think there may have also been some conversations with staff, and I'm wondering if staff could look at this, or if they have already looked at it, indicate how we might deal with it if council was so inclined going forward.
Mr. Lautenbach.
So through the chair, staff have been engaged on this request, and similar to historical requests that came through, our recommendations that we'd fund this request through capital contingencies. That's already built into the budget, and what we would do in the budget resolution, just provide direction that, for the request over the 5-year time frame, I think was, what they were requesting, that we would use that funding in that way to support the request.
So in that regard, I guess if it's 300, it would be 60 over 5 years?
That's correct, and there should be sufficient money to allow for that, and so that would be a recommendation, so it won't require anything other than the budget resolution reflecting that.
Okay, so certainly I wouldn't mind whether it's today or in the coming days hearing from members of council any thoughts they have on that issue.
Thank you very much, and I'm certainly in support. Oh, is there more, Mr. Mayor?
Sorry?
Are you done?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, yeah, I'm certainly in support of that. I know others, including Councillor Johnson. I'm not sure who else has been at the facility, but it's a great project. Speaking of Councillor Johnson, you're up.
Thank you, Chair Davey, and I took that as an invitation to be able to comment to the Mayor about what we would like to see. Is that right?
Yes, anything that hasn't been spoken before, any items that you might potentially bring as an amendment, now would be the time for the difficult job that our Mayor has to put this all together.
It has been spoken of before, obviously, but we just wanted to reiterate how important traffic calming is in the future budget. That's it.
Thank you for allowing
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue, so I believe that would conclude this meeting of Finance and Corporate Services. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Deneau, those in favour? Opposed? That's carried.